I never imagined that a quiet night in Oakwood Estates, our upscale suburban haven in America, would turn into a scene straight out of a nightmare. It was a humid summer night, the kind where the cicadas' chorus and distant hum of traffic were the only sounds breaking the silence. I, Stephen, had just settled into my favorite armchair with a book when an uneasy feeling crawled up my spine. A loud knock at my door shattered the calm. I rose slowly, heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. Outside stood two men in dark uniforms, their badges gleaming under the porch light. Their demeanor was stern, their eyes cold and unyielding. They claimed to be law enforcement officers, yet something about them felt off. "Good evening," one of them said in a clipped tone as I opened the door. "We're here on behalf of the HOA. You're under arrest for violations of the community regulations." My mind raced. HOA? Arrest? I barely understood how the Homeowners Association had the power to enforce rules with such brutality. I glanced down the quiet street. There were no patrol cars, no flashing lights, just these men standing as if they were the only authority in the world. "Arrest me?" I repeated, incredulous. "For what exactly? I haven't broken any law." The taller man stepped forward, his voice rising. "You have repeatedly ignored our posted guidelines, Mr. Stephen. Your actions have disturbed the peace of our community. Now you will come with us." I could see the mock authority in their eyes, but there was something almost theatrical about their performance. Their uniforms were impeccable, yet a subtle detail, the absence of official insignia or the familiar badge of a local police department, betrayed their true nature. My gut told me this wasn't an official law enforcement operation at all. Before I could respond, a neighbor, Mr. Collins, who had been watching the commotion from his window, burst onto the porch. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "Are these real cops?" "Apparently not," I replied, trying to maintain composure despite the adrenaline surging through me. "They're just fake." Mr. Collins shook his head. "I've heard rumors, but this is outrageous. Our HOA has always been too strict, but hiring imposters? That's a new low." The man in the dark jacket scoffed. "This is not a rumor. We have orders to maintain order, and you are jeopardizing the community's image." His words dripped with condescension as if the mere existence of independent thought was a crime. I stepped back, trying to recall any conversation or notice from the HOA that might hint at such extreme measures. Nothing came to mind, only the usual memos about keeping your lawn pristine and not parking outside designated areas. It was absurd. The HOA was a powerful entity in Oakwood Estates, controlling nearly every aspect of our lives under the guise of maintaining property values and community standards. Yet behind its polite facade lurked a network of corruption and unchecked authority. I decided to engage them, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling around me. "If you truly have the authority to arrest me, then you should have proper identification and documentation. Otherwise, I suggest you step back immediately." The shorter officer smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Our authority comes directly from the HOA's board. We don't need the state's permission, only their directive." His statement hung in the air like a challenge. It was clear he believed his power was absolute. At that moment, another neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, emerged from her driveway. "Stephen, what's going on? Is everything all right?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with concern. "Everything is far from all right," I murmured. "These men claim to be enforcing HOA rules with the power of arrest. They're not real cops, and yet they act as if they are." Mrs. Ramirez glanced nervously at the imposters. "I've seen flyers around the neighborhood warning about unauthorized enforcers. I always thought it was just paranoia, but now I'm not so sure." Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. The tension escalated as I insisted, "I need to know who authorized this. I demand to see any documents that prove you have the legal right to detain me." The taller officer hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket. I caught a glimpse of a crumpled piece of paper that looked more like an internal memo than an official warrant. "This is all the proof you need," he said dismissively. I took a step forward, adrenaline surging, and snatched the paper from his hand. The document was poorly printed, with a faded seal and obvious signs of forgery. My pulse quickened as I realized the implications. The HOA was resorting to intimidation tactics well beyond what any reasonable association should exercise. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, voice low and determined. "This isn't law enforcement, it's harassment." Mr. Collins, still hovering at the doorway, added, "We're all being controlled by them, Stephen. They say it's for our own good, but it feels more like tyranny." For a moment, the imposters exchanged glances, their eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. The taller man tried to regain control. "You are obstructing our duty. Comply, and this will all be over quickly." I held his gaze, unflinching. "My duty is to stand up for my rights. And let me be clear, I will not be intimidated by a group of fake cops. In that charged moment, the oppressive nature of the HOA's rule became undeniably clear. Oakwood Estates, with its manicured lawns and pristine facades, masked a dark underbelly of control and corruption. The HOA's influence reached far beyond setting trivial community rules. It extended into every corner of our lives, manipulating fear and enforcing conformity by any means necessary. As the night deepened, I could hear distant murmurs from other residents, some watching from behind drawn curtains, others stepping outside with expressions of disbelief. The community was beginning to stir, a collective realization dawning upon us that we were living under a regime that operated outside the boundaries of true justice. I tucked the forged memo into my jacket, a tangible reminder of the injustice at hand. "I'm going to report this," I declared, my voice resonating with determination. "This isn't just about me, it's about every single resident who has been silenced by the HOA's tyranny." Before the imposters could react, Mrs. Ramirez said softly, "Stephen, be careful. They're not going to let you speak out without a fight." I nodded, acknowledging the risk. "I know, but silence only makes them stronger. We deserve to know the truth about how far their power really goes." At that moment, the imposter in the dark jacket barked, "Enough. You are coming with us now, and any resistance will be met with force." His threat sent a shiver down my spine, yet it also solidified my resolve. The night air grew colder as a metaphorical storm of corruption and power clashed with the embers of individual freedom. In that instant, the quiet suburban street transformed into a battleground between an unjust authority and the spirit of a man unwilling to be cowed by false power. My heart pounded not just with fear, but with the fierce determination to stand up against an oppressive system that sought to control every aspect of our lives. The imposters moved to escort me from my own home, but their steps were halting, as if they too sensed the fragile boundary between order and chaos. Their presence, while intended to instill fear, instead ignited a spark of rebellion within me. I could see now that the HOA's tactics were nothing more than an elaborate ruse to maintain their stranglehold on our community, a community that, beneath its polished veneer, was simmering with unrest and the desire for true freedom. As I was reluctantly led away from the sanctuary of my living room, I made a silent vow I would expose the true nature of this corrupt system. The night's events, shocking as they were, had unmasked a brutal truth. I realized then that my fight was not just for myself, but for every voice that had been stifled under the weight of HOA tyranny. And so, with the forged memo clutched tightly in my hand and the determination burning in my eyes, I embarked on a journey that would soon unravel the dark secrets at the heart of Oakwood Estates. In that surreal and terrifying moment, the line between justice and oppression was irrevocably blurred. The fake cops, symbols of the HOA's unchecked power, were about to discover that authority imposed by fear and deception would never prevail against the unyielding will of a people united by truth. The night after my attempted arrest, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the imposter officers standing at my door, their phony badges gleaming under the porch light. My gut told me this was bigger than just an overzealous HOA. Something deeper was at play, and I was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the forged memo I had taken from the so-called officers. The document was riddled with inconsistencies, poorly formatted text, an unofficial-looking seal, and vague legal jargon that made no real sense. The most telling clue, however, was a signature at the bottom. Richard Calloway, the head of our HOA board. I had never liked Calloway. He was a man who relished control, masquerading his tyranny under the guise of community order. Over the years, he had increased HOA fees, introduced absurdly strict rules, and issued fines for the most minor infractions, parking too close to the curb, leaving a garbage bin out for an extra hour, or failing to trim hedges to a precise length. But hiring fake law enforcement? That was on an entirely different level. I knew I needed more information before making a move, so I reached out to the only person I thought could help, Daniel Grayson, a former police officer who had resigned under mysterious circumstances a few years ago. He was known around the neighborhood as a recluse, someone who didn't trust authority and had little patience for bureaucracy. If anyone could tell me whether these so-called officers were legitimate, it was him. I found Grayson at a rundown diner on the edge of town. He was sitting alone in a booth, nursing a black coffee, his gaze fixed on the outside world like a man perpetually waiting for trouble. "You look like hell," he muttered as I slid into the seat across from him. "Yeah, well, I almost got arrested by fake cops last night. That got his attention." His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto mine. Fake cops. I nodded and handed him the memo. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowing. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he tossed it onto the table. Jesus, these guys aren't even trying to be subtle. So you're saying it's definitely fake? Oh, it's fake, all right. No department issues garbage like this. And look at this. He tapped Calloway's signature. Your HOA president signed off on this nonsense. That means he's directly involved. My stomach clenched. Why would the HOA go this far? What's their endgame? Grayson leaned in, lowering his voice. Control. Fear. These HOA boards, especially in rich suburban areas like this, they operate like little dictatorships. The problem is, most people don't fight back. They assume the HOA has real legal power, but in reality, it's just a bunch of bureaucrats who rely on intimidation. He took a sip of coffee, then continued. But this? Hiring guys to pose as law enforcement? That's a new level of corruption. So what can I do? Grayson smirked. You're asking the wrong guy. If I were you, I'd pack my bags and move. But I get the feeling you're not gonna do that. He was right. I couldn't just let this go. Then I need proof, I said. Real proof that Calloway and the HOA are behind this. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. I might know a guy, ex-private investigator, specializes in HOA corruption cases. He's been tracking a few cases like this, but nothing quite this extreme. He pulled out a notepad, scribbled down a name and number, and slid it across the table. Call him. If anyone can help, it's him. I pocketed the note, feeling both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. Thanks, Grayson. He gave me a wary look. Don't thank me yet. If Calloway is willing to send goons to your house, he won't hesitate to push harder if he thinks you're a threat. I nodded, fully aware of the danger. Then I guess I'll have to be careful. Later that evening, I dialed the number Grayson had given me. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ethan Carter, a former PI who had spent the last few years investigating shady HOA practices across the country. You're telling me your HOA actually hired fake cops? Carter asked, disbelief evident in his voice. I have proof, I replied. A forged memo with the HOA president's signature. I just don't know how deep this goes. There was a brief silence before Carter spoke again. It goes deeper than you think. I've seen cases like this before, HOAs using intimidation tactics, scare tactics, even hiring private security firms to act as unofficial enforcers. But if your HOA is bold enough to impersonate law enforcement, that means they feel untouchable. So what's my move? You need hard evidence. Photos, recordings, financial records, anything that links them to these fake officers. If we can prove Calloway is funding these guys, we can take this to the authorities. How do I even begin to gather that kind of evidence? Start with their money. Most HOA boards have secret slush funds. Money collected from unnecessary fines and maintenance fees that never actually go toward maintaining anything. If you can find where that money is going, you'll find your answer. That night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I broke into the HOA's office. It wasn't as difficult as I expected. The building, a small but well-furnished space near the community center, had a laughably outdated security system. A well-placed screwdriver and some patience got me inside. The office was filled with neatly organized file cabinets and a single desktop computer. I went for the computer first. The moment I accessed the HOA's financial records, my suspicions were confirmed. Large sums of money were being funneled into a private security firm, one that didn't exist in any official state registry. I took photos of every document I could find, my hands shaking slightly as I scrolled through transaction after transaction. The money wasn't just going to fake law enforcement. It was going to something bigger, a network of enforcers across multiple communities, all under Calloway's control. Just as I was finishing up, I heard footsteps outside. My heart stopped. I quickly shut down the computer and slipped behind a filing cabinet just as the office door creaked open. A voice I recognized instantly, Calloway's, spoke into a phone. Yeah, he's a problem. We need to handle it before he starts spreading this shit around. Make sure he understands we're not playing games. My blood ran cold. They were coming for me. I held my breath as he rifled through some papers, then finally exited the office, slamming the door behind him. Only when I was sure he was gone did I slip out the back door, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the entire community, maybe even beyond Oakwood Estates. The HOA was running a full-fledged operation, using fear and deception to control residents, and I had just uncovered the proof. As I made my way home under the cover of darkness, one thing was certain. I wasn't safe anymore, but I wasn't backing down either. The tension had been building for days. I knew I was on borrowed time after breaking into the HOA office and uncovering the slush fund. Calloway wouldn't let me walk away from this unscathed. I just didn't expect him to strike so soon or so publicly. 2 days after my break-in, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. The email, signed by Calloway himself, claimed it was to address serious concerns regarding community safety. The wording was carefully chosen, just vague enough to stir paranoia, just urgent enough to ensure a full turnout. I wasn't stupid. This was bait. But I had no choice. If I didn't show up, Calloway would spin whatever narrative he wanted. He'd frame me as a troublemaker, a criminal, someone who had violated the trust of the community. If I wanted the truth to come out, I had to be there. So I made my move. Before heading to the meeting, I called Grayson and Carter. "This is it," I told them. "He's making his move tonight." "Then you'd better be ready," Carter said. "Did you get copies of the financial records?" "I did," I confirmed. "They're on a flash drive, plus I uploaded everything to a secure cloud." Grayson exhaled through the phone. "That's good. But Calloway isn't just going to let you wave some papers around and call it a day. If he's pushing this hard, it means he's desperate." I didn't need him to spell it out for me. If Calloway felt backed into a corner, things could get dangerous. "I'll be there," Grayson continued. "If this turns ugly, I'll make sure you get out." Carter added, "I've reached out to some local reporters. If we can make enough noise, we might be able to get real law enforcement to step in." I hung up, knowing that whatever happened tonight, there was no turning back. The community center was packed when I arrived. Residents filled the rows of chairs, whispering among themselves. There was an undercurrent of unease in the air. People sensed something was wrong, but they couldn't quite put their fingers on it. At the front of the room, Calloway stood behind a podium, flanked by 2 of the fake officers from the other night. Their uniforms looked even more suspicious under the fluorescent lights, their belts carrying tasers instead of real firearms. That alone told me they weren't legitimate cops. No real law enforcement officer would ever patrol without a service weapon. I scanned the room and spotted Grayson near the exit, arms crossed, keeping a watchful eye on everything. Carter wasn't here yet, but I knew he was working in the background. Calloway tapped the microphone. The chatter died down. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I called this emergency meeting because we have a serious problem in our community, a threat that endangers our safety and the integrity of Oakwood Estates." A murmur ran through the crowd. People shifted in their seats. Calloway continued, "I regret to inform you that one of our residents has been actively working to sabotage the security of our neighborhood." He turned his eyes on me. "That person is Stephen." The murmur turned into a low rumble of confusion. Some people turned to look at me, others whispered among themselves. Calloway gestured toward the 2 fake officers. "These men attempted to lawfully detain Stephen the other night, under suspicion of trespassing and property damage. But instead of cooperating, he assaulted them and fled. This behavior is unacceptable." I shot to my feet. "That's a lie." Calloway held up a hand, feigning disappointment. "I wish it were, Stephen, but we have proof." He nodded to one of the fake cops, who pulled out a grainy, black and white image from what looked like a security camera. It showed a shadowy figure inside the HOA office. It was too blurry to make out the face, but I knew what Calloway was doing, using just enough misinformation to cast doubt. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. "This man," Calloway continued, "has been conducting illegal activity in our community. spreading lies, stirring fear, and worst of all, he's endangered all of us. That was my breaking point. I stepped forward. "You want proof?" I shouted, pulling out my phone. "I have proof too. Real proof. Not some manipulated footage." I tapped the screen, casting a slideshow onto the projector behind Calloway. The crowd gasped again, but this time for a different reason. Displayed on the screen were the financial records I had stolen. Transaction logs, bank transfers, payments from the HOA to an unregistered security firm, the same firm that had supplied Calloway with his fake police force. The room erupted into chaos. "What the hell is this?" someone shouted. "Where did our HOA fees go?" another demanded. Calloway's face darkened. He slammed a fist on the podium. "This is nonsense. Lies fabricated by a criminal. Then why don't you explain it?" I challenged. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the fake cops reached for their tasers. The crowd screamed. I had seconds to react. The tasers crackled as the fake cops aimed them at me. Before they could fire, Grayson moved. With the speed of a man trained for violence, he tackled one of them to the ground, knocking the weapon out of his hands. The second man hesitated just long enough for a group of residents, who had clearly had enough of Calloway's reign, to jump him. The room was pure chaos. Chairs were knocked over. People shouted and scrambled. The fake cops, overwhelmed and outnumbered, fought back but were quickly subdued. Someone had the sense to call 911. And then Calloway did something I didn't expect. He ran. I saw him bolt for the back exit, shoving past panicked residents. Not on my watch. I sprinted after him. He crashed through the door, running toward the parking lot. He was fast, but fear made me faster. I caught up to him just as he reached his car. I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him backward. He stumbled, swinging wildly at me. I dodged, slamming him against the hood of his car. "Give it up, Calloway," I growled. His face was red with rage, sweat beading on his forehead. "You have no idea what you've just done." "Yeah," I panted. "Pretty sure I just took down your entire operation." Then I heard the sirens. The real cops had arrived. I stepped back as flashing red and blue lights filled the parking lot. Officers stormed the community center, arresting the fake cops and taking statements from the residents. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers reached us, pulling Calloway away from the car and slapping cuffs on him. "You're making a mistake," he shouted. "This is MY community. I built this. You'll regret this." I watched as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. For the first time in days, I finally felt like I could breathe. Grayson walked up beside me, arms crossed. "Told you it'd turn ugly." I let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah, but at least it's over." Grayson smirked. "Not yet. You still have a whole HOA to deal with." I groaned. "One battle at a time." And as the last of the fake cops were hauled away, I realized that for the first time in a long while, the community was finally free. The night of the HOA meeting had been absolute chaos. By the time the police finished questioning everyone, it was nearly dawn. Calloway had been dragged away in cuffs. His fake cops were in custody, and the residents of Oakwood Estates stood in stunned silence as the illusion of their orderly community crumbled before them. But for me, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of the scandal spread like wildfire. Carter had done his job well. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting the corruption of the HOA board. Words like fraud, illegal enforcement, and abuse of power were thrown around. Suddenly, Oakwood Estates was no longer just a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a headline. I watched it all unfold from my living room, exhausted but unable to look away. Reporters swarmed the community gates, demanding statements from residents. People who had once blindly followed the HOA's rules were now fuming, realizing they had been paying into a system that had been exploiting them for years. 2 days after Calloway's arrest, I got a call from Grayson. "Turn on Channel 5, he said. I grabbed the remote and flipped to the station. A serious-looking news anchor stared back at me. "Breaking news," she announced. "New details emerge in the Oakwood Estates HOA corruption scandal." Financial records obtained by investigators suggest that the fraudulent security firm hired by HOA President Richard Callaway had ties to multiple communities across the state. Experts now suspect that this was part of a much larger operation, one that may have affected hundreds of homeowners associations nationwide. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about Callaway. This was bigger. That night, Carter called me. His voice was sharper than usual, tinged with urgency. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Not yet," I muttered, already sensing bad news. I sank onto the couch. "What's going on?" "The security firm Callaway was paying? Turns out it's not just some fake company he set up. It's part of a network. We're talking about a nationwide operation. HOA boards hiring private enforcers to intimidate, threaten, and silence residents across the country. Callaway was just one piece of the puzzle." I gripped the phone tighter. "You're telling me this is happening in other neighborhoods?" "Not just happening. It's been happening for years," Carter said. "And guess what? A lot of these HOA leaders, people just like Callaway, have been getting kickbacks from it. They fine residents for nonsense violations, jack up community fees, and then funnel that money into these enforcers." I felt sick. "How deep does this go?" I asked. "That's the thing," Carter said. "We don't know yet, but I can tell you this, whoever is running this isn't happy that Callaway got exposed. If they think you had something to do with it, you might have just painted a target on your back." I exhaled, trying to steady my nerves. "What do we do now?" "We keep pushing," Carter said. "The news is already out. Law enforcement is involved now. This thing is too big to sweep under the rug." But something about his tone made me uneasy. "Carter," I said, "be honest with me. Are we actually safe?" There was a pause. "I don't know," he admitted. "For a few weeks, things seemed to settle. Callaway and his fake cops remained in custody. The HOA board was dissolved. The community held emergency meetings to figure out how to move forward. People started seeing me differently. Some looked at me like I was a hero. Others just looked uncomfortable, like they wished I had never dug into any of this in the first place. "You know," Grayson said one evening as we stood outside my house, "they'll probably try to get rid of the HOA entirely." "Good," I said. Grayson smirked. "You really think this is over?" I sighed. "I don't know, but I wanted to believe it was. I wanted to believe that, for once, corruption had been exposed and justice had prevailed. I should have known better." A month after Callaway's arrest, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside my house. Car engine. Idling. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I moved to the window and peeked through the blinds. A black SUV. No plates. It had been parked there for at least 5 minutes. Something was wrong. I grabbed my phone and texted Grayson. "SUV outside my house. No plates. Been there for a while." The second the message sent, the SUV's headlights flicked on. The engine revved and then sped away. I stared at the empty street, my pulse racing. A warning. I wasn't safe. Not even close. The next morning, I got a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Stop digging." I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Was it a bluff? A scare tactic? Or was someone actually watching me? I called Carter, relaying what had happened. There was silence on the other end. Then he said, "Steven, I think we just pissed off the wrong people." I exhaled, gripping the paper in my hands. I had thought Callaway was the end of this. I had thought that once he was gone, things would go back to normal. But I was wrong. This was just the beginning.